back to Janus Academy's course Historical Analogies. This will be the 12th in our series, and this is a bit of a different one because, as you may have noticed thus far, we always followed this rhythm of bringing together two different periods that were separated by a certain amount of time, and we would always progress from one period to the next. So there was a clear chronological organization that was involved with this. Today we're making a bit of an exception that is going to go through with some of the sequent chapters, and we are comparing one particular period today with something that we already talked about. And when I'm mentioning this, I'm talking about the Gothic revival on one end and abstract art on the other. So in the previous installment we discussed Gothic revival and Dada and their connection. So nowadays we're staying with the Gothic revival on one end, but we're moving towards abstract art on the other. So all of these things are very much connected, and abstract art has a lot to do with Dada, but is its own different thing that merits its own inquiry. Now, again, as was the case with Dada, when we are talking about Gothic revival, we are not necessarily talking about style, meaning visuals. We are talking about school of thought, a particular worldview, and particular philosophy. So we will argue that abstract art is fundamentally medieval. Now, of course, we know that abstract art doesn't really happen in medieval period. It's not medieval chronologically, but it is medieval spiritually and thematically. It has a lot to do with medieval worldview, and this is something we aim to substantiate today. So when we're talking about this, we're talking about some artists that are more important than the others. We are not excluding artists that we shall not mention today. There are many important artists that we shall not mention. We will be focusing on the ones that are pertinent for our particular point of view. So we're going to be talking a lot about Kandinsky, we're going to be talking a lot about Malevich, and we'll be mentioning František Kupka as an important counterpoint to both of these. So what I want to begin with is this whole idea that both abstract art as well as Dada, as well as Gothic revival, they all have antecedencies. So they all come out of already existing eras, and this is all the more important knowing that we are still in the period of the early 20th century. So we are still in the period where a lot of different styles coexist. So something that will be very important for the sequent lecture that we do is the coexistence of neoclassical and Gothic revival styles. So two revival styles. So we're going to dedicate a full hour of conversation to this topic because it is really important. Now, in this particular case, we're talking about the fact that abstract art has a lot to do with expressionism on one end and impressionism on the other. It has very, very strong connections with both of these. It grows out of impressionism in one way, and it grows out of expressionism in the other. So just a brief mention that abstract art has a lot to do with expressionism, and the bridge, the connection between the two is, of course, the person of Vasily Kandinsky, who started his painting career as, amongst other things, an expressionist. He was the founder of a very famous Blau Reiter group, the Blue Rider, or the Blue Cavalier, if you will. So this is one line of connection, and it brings us back to everything we already said about expressionism in our previous presentation that was dedicated to it. But it also has a very strong connection to impressionism, arguably even stronger and arguably even more important. Now, we do know that we dedicated an entire course, one of the introductory ones, to the connection that exists between Gothic art on one end and Impressionism on the other. And this connection was as visual as it was spiritual, conceptual, and thematic. So you could say that there is a very strong connection when it comes to Impressionism and abstract art, as well as Impressionism and Gothic art, and then, of course, Gothic art and abstract art. So I want to elaborate this a bit. I want to explain why we see these connections happening, and I want to explain why we see Impressionism as such an important presence in the birth and existence of abstract art. Now, this particular take goes to foundational elements of Impressionism, that it's an era, it's a stylistical formation rather, that is very strongly involved in visuals and not terribly interested in symbolism, in meaning, in representations. Now, of course, this is not the case with all of Impressionists. We have some Impressionists who are very, very political and openly so with their paintings. So we could say that Renoir, for example, is a very politically engaged individual, and his paintings are very, very colored by this. So you could say the same for Degas, you could say the same for Manet, though Manet is not necessarily seen as impressionist. He is rather post post academist, proto impressionist. So there is this discussion amongst art historians if Manet is an impressionist or not. It's not very important for our current conversation. So the fact is that when we're talking about this particular trait of impressionism that interests us, that connects it to abstract art, we are talking about Monet for all. And we're talking about this characteristic of Monet's art, that he was very strongly interested in visuals and little else, not to say anything else. So Monet was famous for saying that his paintings explicitly mean nothing. They stand for nothing. They represent nothing other than beautiful colors. So what he aims to achieve with his art is just images that are completely free from any interpretation, from any contextualization. So he doesn't seek to deliver a message, he seeks to create beautiful visual art. And you could argue that Monet, in this particular regard, is a pure visual artist. So this becomes very, very important for abstract art. Abstract art is quite pure, even more so than Monet's art. So you could say that in this particular vein, we have a great connection between visuals of the Gothic stained glass window and Impressionism. This we already covered. And then on the other end, you have this whole idea that Monet's take on things is that he doesn't create art for purposes of messaging or propaganda or spreading ideology or social engagement and all of these different things that you can use art for. No, he creates art for art's sake. So he wants to create beautiful images, and that's all he cares about. Now, let's put beauty aside. Let's just stay with this idea that you create images for images' sake. You're not really interested in meaning of images. So this is exactly what is being developed in this particular case by abstract art. People who are invested in creating images and not connecting these images to the already existing world as it is. So this is a very clear step away from mimetism, this idea that was very, very dominant in world of arts for arguably thousands of years, if not tens of thousands of years. This idea of representative art, figurative art, formal art, that the point of art is that, especially when it comes to visual arts, is that you want to represent already existing things. You want to represent something that is recognizable. So you could argue that even when it comes to literature, Aristotle argues that the whole purpose of literature is to show us certain situations that we can empathize with, that we can understand because we can see ourselves in those. And he argues furthermore that mimetism is a very, very important trait, not only of art, but of humanity, that we learn through mimesis, that we imitate other people in their actions, in their thoughts, in their desires. There's a very interesting inquiry done into mimetism by Freud, and then especially by René Girard. I've spent a lot of time studying René Girard, and I'll probably be constantly going back to this reference throughout different lectures. But the point here is that abstract artists, especially people like Malevich, especially Kandinsky, try to move away from mimetism. Now, you understand that the way Aristotle and then all these sequent researchers and theoreticians explained mimetism was not only as something that has to do with world of arts, but something that is so fundamentally built into the very foundation of humanity. So they believe that mimetism is truly how we exist, not to say why we exist. But the thing is that if you want to move away from mimetism, you're truly trying to do something that is a radical departure from how this world functions, from how this world is. And this is something that takes us right back to our point why we see abstract art as medieval. The heart of it all is this divorce from the material world. Now, of course, since we're talking about art, we are talking about techniques and tools that are available to artists. So this divorce, this separation from the material world is done in this very peculiar manner. So you could say that this whole idea renouncing the world was present already with the Dadaist movement. And it's the idea that we connected to the eastern part of the world with Eastern Orthodox Christianity, to be more precise. And when it comes to Dada, but also to a certain extent when it comes to abstract art, it has a lot to do with this phenomenon that is quite well known in the eastern part of the world amongst the Orthodox folk, that is called the Eurodivi. So you could translate this term to English by fool for Christ or foolishness for Christ. So the idea is that if you are Eurodiv, if you are a fool for Christ, you basically go back to this very fundamental early idea of Christianity, that you renounce the material world as such, you renounce wealth, possession, even clothes that you would wear, and you renounce logic of this world because you are embracing a superior type of logic. Now, this is where the notion of Eurodivi, the foolishness for Christ, bifurcates to a certain extent when we're talking about abstract art, and then when we're talking about Dadaism. Now, Dadaism was all about renouncing this world and espousing a different kind of logic, arguably superior kind of logic, but they did not dwell so much on the, how should we put this? They did not dwell so much about this superior logic as it was. Their focus was more on the renouncing of the world as it was. And they were very busy with ridiculing and laughing at the world as it was, showing it as destructive, as absurd, as completely nonsensical. When it comes to abstract art, these creators actually suggest the path that they can move towards to. So they're not interested in the world they're leaving behind. They're not busy with ridiculing it. They are just simply ignoring it. They want this complete departure from the world, and they want us to see this superior logic not necessarily as fundamentally divorced from the existing world, but as just very, very different. Now, I say this because in abstract art, we do have presence of certain things that we can recognize in this particular world. And this is kind of the whole point of abstract art, is that it doesn't profoundly and radically rejects the laws that are present in this world. It rather refines them, and it returns them to us in a polished, advanced, abstracted, sorry, this is poorly worded, but what are you going to do, abstracted form. So it's rather a synthesis and a distillation of whatever is worthy in this world, whatever rules and laws we have, than their radical abandon. So it's this idea that if you want to abandon this world, you do not leave all of it behind, as is the case with Dada, and you are not necessarily that political about it. I would argue that some artists, like let's say Kandinsky, are not as overtly political about their work as was, for example, Malevich, another artist that we're going to be talking about today. Now, you can see that both Kandinsky and Malevich come from Russia. They come from the eastern part of the world. When I say this, I'm not talking about Russian nationality or Russian culture. I am truly talking about Orthodox context, so Orthodox Christianity. And I think this is really important if we want to properly understand abstract art. It has a lot to do with orthodoxy, and it has a lot to do with Orthodox take on things. Now, you could say that there are visible influences of Orthodox aesthetics already present in Western European art. When we're talking about Cézanne, we're talking about his fascination with Orthodox icons. When we're talking about Picasso, we're talking about his fascination with Orthodox icons. And I think we already mentioned this in one of our previous lectures. So we already have this influence. If we go back to the Renaissance period, one of the dominant theories of how Renaissance began in the first place was that it began with the fall of Constantinople in 1453, which meant that a lot of scholars, philosophers, artists, generally speaking, educated people, fled from fallen Byzantine Empire to Western Europe, and they brought all these incredible influences, developments, ideas, etc. with them. So, when we're talking about abstract art, we are not talking about this radical intrusion or a penetration of orthodoxy into the Western, mostly Catholic and Protestant mainstream. We are talking about an Orthodox principle that embodies itself in a very concrete manner. And the Orthodox principle, when I talk about this, I truly talk about what you can see in an Orthodox icon. is this idea that you have a pathway, you have a window or a door, if you will, into the superior world, into the superior logic. Now, I would argue that abstract art is a step further away from the icon, because icon is a door towards this world, and abstract art is already this world. So in a way, you can also compare it to a Gothic cathedral or a Gothic church being the embodiment of heaven already here on earth. So it's not that you are traveling to heaven. In a way, it's that you have already arrived. Now, of course, the vision of heaven, what it is, what it looks like, is very different in case of abstract art and in the case of Gothic art or Gothic interiors, but the driving principle is very similar. So therefore, it is quite interesting to say that these people, these two major influences that have shaped abstract art, Malevich and Kandinsky, come from Orthodox contexts. So this is by no means a coincidence. Now, when we are talking about this, we are talking about this whole idea that abstract art represents a certain distillation, a certain simplification. And again, we go back to the notion of simplification that is so incredibly important in the context of 20th century art. So we're talking about this whole idea that less is more, and that we are using this idea of less is more to refine, to purify, indeed to abstract whatever we are interested in. And whatever we are interested in has to do with fundamental laws of art, I would say of painting, but generally we're really talking about art, even if we're talking about literature, even if we're talking about other non-visual laws of art, music, for example. So what I'm talking about is that abstract art presents us with this notion of fundamental laws of art becoming art themselves. So what do I mean by this? If you go to any pre-modern museum, and if you take a look at, let's say, a Renaissance or a Baroque or a classical painting, it doesn't really matter, any of these eras would do as an example, you can say that the painting represents, let's say, a crucifixion. This is a very broad and very easy to imagine example. So you say that you are looking at the painting of a crucifixion, you're looking at Christ on a cross, and you can say that this painting, by definition, has a composition, it has a harmony of colors, it has different plans, it has, in most cases, if we're talking about Renaissance and onwards, depth of field, a certain idea of dimensionality. So it has a line, it has a mass, it has a treatment of light. So all of these things are laws of art, laws of visual art. Now, if you want to abstract that a bit further, you can say, okay, if we don't want to deal with light or mass or depth of field, we can still stay with notions of composition, notions of harmony, notions of rhythm, contrapunct to a certain extent, alteration, contrast. So all of these are laws that exist in music, as well as they do in architecture, as well as they do in painting, as well as they do in literature. So these are really abstract laws that deal with beauty as such. So this art really is made not by using these laws, but it's made by using and representing these laws. So these are laws of harmony, laws of composition, laws of art embodied, visualized, if you will. So you could say, to go back to our initial example of the Renaissance, let's say Renaissance painting, you could say that this painting does have laws of harmony, of composition, of rhythm, all these things, but then on top of it all, it has the actual message that is giving us. So we see that it's crucifixion. And then if we come from Christian context, we know that it means a whole lot of things. So it's basically telling us a story. Now, abstract artists are saying that this is all entirely unnecessary, and this is something that has nothing to do with visual arts. So they would argue that if you want a story, you should then go and read a book, quite literally. If you want to have some sort of ideas shared or explained to you, that should probably be a philosophy book or a history book. If you want to learn something about humanity, you should probably read a book about anthropology. And again, if you want to have your emotions moved or shaken or whatever, you should probably read a novel or a poem or something that comes from the realm of literature, something that comes from the realm of fiction. Now, none of these, they would argue, has to do with visual arts. Visual arts need to be there for visual purposes, and they need to communicate to you visual means. So this is a very radical departure from everything that painting was up until that moment. It's the idea that painting should be better defined, statues as well, sculpture as well. It should exist in its own realm, and it's basically an effort towards the further differentiation of art. And you can see how different this is from Dada, because Dada, although existed in roughly the same chronology, roughly the same time period, Dada is all about bringing different arts together. It's all about using ready-made objects. It's about performance, dance, theater, all these other things. So it's about mixed media, I think we would call it this way today. But abstract art takes a completely opposite route. It wants visual art to be better defined, and it wants visual art to have to do only with the visuals. So it's this idea that we are transported into this superior realm of existence, Platonic realm, if you will, of pure forms that are given to us in visual media. So the idea is therefore that we want to liberate ourselves, we want to purify our being, our perception really, and we want our perception to be purely visual. Now you can see how this goes back to this whole notion that is present in a Gothic cathedral, or a Gothic church rather, that you want to elevate your spirit, you want to purify your spirit. This is the whole idea of the church experience, of the experience of the Mass. So this is what you seek with art. You want your being to be purified, and your experience as a spectator is to be headed in this direction. This is what you want to do. This is what you expect of art. And again, these artists are stating, if you want a story, that's the domain of literature. If you want ideas, that's the domain of philosophy. So what they want to do is they want to bring the visual domain back to visuals, and they want you to think about paintings in visual terms. So this is a very peculiar thing, and we'll go back to it. Now, as you can understand, this is all a very, very radical departure from whatever was considered to be art in this particular moment. And I want to take a moment to remind you that we are still talking about the period where Gothic revival is a very important presence and where neoclassicism is a very important presence. So we're still talking about this particular context. But nevertheless, if we are to talk about history as such, and especially about politics, we are also talking about the presence of World War I. And we're talking in most cases about the period either right after World War I or the period that is in between World War I and World War II. So we have this dramatic shift of consciousness. We have this dramatic influence that was exerted onto European and indeed world culture by this tragic, horrific event. And we can say that we also have another thing that is arguably as important, if not more so, happening on the other end of the world. And this is, of course, the Bolshevik Revolution. Now, when we talk about World War I, we are talking about, well, its very appellation that it's a world war. And this is true to a certain extent, but it is only true, or I would say it is mostly true if we are talking about the First World. You could argue that the World War I did not terribly trouble the Third World, so it was mostly a European affair that was fought between colonial powers, but the colonies themselves were not as interested in it as the people from the First World War were. Now, if we're talking about the Bolshevik Revolution, it's a completely different situation. You could argue that for the Third World, which to this day is the majority of humanity, this is something that was of far greater interest and of much greater influence for the Third World. This is something that people watched, observed, and were terribly, terribly invested in. Basically, people from all of the planet. So whereas the World War I was such a profoundly formative and deeply tragic experience for the part of the world where it happened, which is Western Europe, well, you could argue entire Europe, but when we think about it, we tend to emphasize Western Europe, Western and Central. Bolshevik Revolution really was a global affair, and it was a globally influential affair. Now, we tend to look at world from Eurocentric perspective, and when we're talking about history of art or general history, we tend to really focus on Europe for many reasons. We're not going to go into that now, and all of them are wrong. But we fail to truly acknowledge global presence and global importance of certain ideas. Now, the reason why I'm talking about the Bolshevik Revolution this much is that, amongst other things, it has engendered and gave birth to different artistic formations, out of which several are incredibly important for our context and for our story here. So I'm talking in this case in particular about Kazimir Malevich and his involvement in the Bolshevik Revolution and his artistic revolutionary work. And when I'm talking about this, I'm talking about his take on abstract art and how it aided in the revolution and how it carried the legacy of the Bolshevik Revolution. You could argue that in many ways, art of Kazimir Malevich is the Bolshevik Revolution presented through visual means. And you could argue that suprematism and constructivism, branches of abstract art that grew out of Malevich's work, were very, very important and very influential. Now, again, I needed to bring this first third world dynamic into play because it truly is important for us to understand just how important his creation was for the rest of the world, not just for Europe, but also for Europe. So what I'm going to be taking as an example now is a very famous and rather infamous example of the Black Square. This is one of those works of art that is proclaimed, again, by different art historians, depending which country they come from, as one of the most important works of art or artifacts of the 20th century. Incredibly influential and incredibly ambitious. And, as I would argue, profoundly medieval in its very essence, in its very ambition and its very purpose. So why do I say this? Well, this work is a drastical and radical rupture in all of history of art. It's basically not entirely a work of art. I'm kind of struggling to fully label it as a work of art because much like as was the case with Dada, this was the work of anti-art. This was something that went against the very existence of art in this particular understanding that we have for art as something that comes out of tradition of Enlightenment, Cartesian school of thought, etc. So it's decidedly anti-bourgeois, it's decidedly anti-capitalistic, and it's anti-artistic, and it's very much anti-material. It's a very, very simple visual communication. Arguably the most simple visual communication of them all. And if you know what I'm talking about, you know that it's basically a black square on white surface. And that's really all there is to it. So arguably there are no simpler forms to communicate other than this. Now, there's a lot to unpack here. Why would one black square be of such importance? Well, you could say that, again, this is not really a work of art, it's a cenotaph. Why do I say this? It's basically a tombstone without the actual body. And the actual body that is being buried there, but it's not quite there, is the body of Western civilization and Western art. And again, when we say this, we're talking about capitalistic bourgeois, Enlightenment, influenced and shaped, etc., etc., etc. This is the kind of body that we're talking about. So this is a tombstone, and it's a cenotaph rather, and it's a very clear message that we are drawing a line in the sand. So we are making a full stop and we are venturing into something completely different. So what this particular work of art is doing is that it's saying that we are done with the world as it was before. It's behind us. It's no more. So once the communist revolution is a success, we will find ourselves in a completely different world. And if you remember our conversation on the topic of Dada, people were very much under impression that this was necessary, that the old world was, well, downright terrible. It resulted in World War I, which was this overwhelming destruction of what it seemed to be the very humanity. So you could argue that the old world was killing itself, and it was basically devouring itself. It came to a very violent paroxysm and could not exist anymore. So there was this very prevalent idea that if we don't change the world as it was, we are going to perish. We are going to literally exterminate the entire humanity. And it seemed for a very solid period of time that we were doing exactly that. Then in World War II, we would come back to it in full force on an even larger scale. So the idea was that if we want to survive, we have to change ourselves. We have to build a completely different society. We have to imagine and create a completely different economy. Again, as was the case with Dada, everything had to change. Literally everything. So you cannot build a new society and have old consciousness. You cannot have old worldviews in this new world that you are creating. And so everything has to change, meaning art and artistic production and values that we espouse and all of it together. So you could say that this particular work of art was a line in the sand, saying we are burying the old world and everything it presents, and we are starting anew. Now, this is not only the case when it comes to Dada and abstract art, or suprematist and constructivist art in this case. This was also present in the case of Italian futurism. So this happens at the same time. And it's this very interesting attitude that people are driven to this conclusion, not necessarily if they are superbly and industrially orthodox, but also if they're just interested and enthusiastic for the industrial revolution and the industrial process as such. So you have people like the Delaunay couple, you have the famous Manifest of Futurism written by Marinetti. These are works of people who are profoundly impressed by the industrial process and everything that it can bring. So they are impressed by this new capacity that we have to traverse much greater distances, to fly, to communicate using telephones and telegraphs. So these are all truly major discoveries. And they argue that not only for our politics and our consciousness and our individuality, not only for greed that leads us to war, but also just for the very fact that we are now industrialized, everything has to change. Now, Marinetti was famous for saying that one sports car is worth more than 10,000 Mona Lisas. So I will give you a moment to contemplate this. And he also said that we should burn down all of the museums. Literally, we should destroy every single piece of art that we have if we're talking about art that comes from the old world. Now, this is a tendency that we have and we have had throughout our history. You can talk about the very recent destruction of 3,000-year-old statues in Palmyra, a tragic affair indeed. You can talk about this overall broad, widespread destruction of pagan statues as was done by early Christians. You can talk about the fact that for whichever reason we lost 99% of all of the literature of antiquity. That's a whole other topic and a whole story unto itself. So for whichever reason, we have these cycles as humanity of a cultural purge where we have this very strong desire to destroy everything that existed up to this moment. So yeah, not to get into this, it would take us to very strange places, but this is what the Italian futurists argued. So they argued that art that was produced before the Industrial Revolution expanded cannot communicate with us anymore. We are different now. We can fly. This is an amazing thing. We can go incredibly fast. So we are not the same people anymore. We need new culture. We need new art. And so we'd have to destroy all of the museums because they are clutter. They are dragging us back. They're holding us behind. They're basically just dead weight. So if we're talking about medieval character of abstract art, this becomes very clear. It becomes obvious that we're talking about matter that is seen as a clutter and that is seen as a burden to pure spirit. So this is what Hegel was talking about when he was talking about Romanticism, that the spirit is trying to fully actualize itself, and that the spirit emerges throughout different stages of development, symbolical, classical, and romantic, so that we have this whole idea of spirit liberating itself from matter through struggle, through dialectics in a certain way. So you could argue that this is a part of that process, that abstract art is entirely about spirit trying to purify itself, trying to distance itself, trying to remove itself from matter. So if we are to talk about this idea from futurists, that we have to burn everything that came before us, we have to destroy, we have to start from a clean plate, this is also done by Malevich, but arguably in a less violent manner. Now, why are we talking about all of this from the medieval point of view, and why do we insist that there is a strong religious connotation to all of this, that there is a strong aspect of religiosity in all of this? Well, the first time when Malevich presented the black square to the world, he has done that in a very peculiar manner. He situated the painting, or, well, a work of art, not sure if it's really a painting, but anyhow. So he situated it in the eastern corner of the gallery. Now, if you come from the Orthodox part of the world, as I do, you know that the eastern corner of the living room of your home is the most important space of your entire abode. Be it a house, be it an apartment, it doesn't really matter. So this is where you hold the icon. This is where you pray throughout the day. This is where you perform your religious duties if you don't go to the church. So this is the holiest of all of spaces, and it's terribly important and such. You could argue that this is basically the most important, the most spiritual space of your entire house, which is arguably sacred in its own right just by the quality of being your house. So this is where the icon is. And the way that Malevich presented Black Square was so as to clearly associate it with an icon. So as to say, these are our icons now. So we are changing everything. We are not just changing the state through the revolution that was brewing. We are not just changing politics, ideology, economy, because they wanted to bring communism instead of capitalism. We are truly changing our religion. We are changing our spirituality. And we have to do with our religion the same thing that we have to do with our culture and with our arts. We have to start it from scratch. Everything has to start from zero. So what Malevich was doing with his Black Square was literally suggesting a completely new visual language. So as is the case with everything, you start with baby steps, you start simple, and then later you make it more complex. So he wanted to start this incredibly ambitious new journey into the new realms and new possibilities of humanity by using the simplest of all shapes, which is a square. Now, it's interesting to say that we have certain symbolism associated to geometric bodies. When we're talking about the square and the circle, these are of particular importance because we are talking about foundational geometric bodies, foundational elements of Orthodox churches in most cases. So in most cases, an Orthodox church would be made with the square foundation, cubic foundation, if we're talking about three-dimensional space, and with the dome on top of it. So domes stand for heaven, they stand for the spiritual realm, they stand for something that has to do with eternal realm of existence. And the squares stand for material realm. So you could argue that even in alchemy, circles represent perfection. With pagan Greeks, this is also the case. A circle represents aesthetic ideal. I was going to say maximum, but that sounds kind of weird. And the squares represent something that we can achieve as humanity, something that is of this world. So square represents effort, humane effort, whereas circle represents the spirit and rather divine than human, rather spiritual than material realm. So Malevich intentionally chooses a square because the whole character of the revolution is to deny authority of the emperor in case of Russia, so to deny this notion of holiness that comes from the emperor, that emperor is divinely ordained, that is chosen by God. All of these things, they flat out refuse all of these premises, and they want to focus on what is of this earth. They want to focus on matter, and they want to start their spiritual journey, this is really important, from the realm of matter. So they want this to be the first and the simplest step that is to be made in this incredibly ambitious endeavor. So why do I say that it's incredibly ambitious? Well, because it aims at rebuilding the entire world. So literally everything. When we were talking about Dada, we gave an example of this whole idea that you have to refuse literally everything, and we gave an example of the French Revolution, as it adopted a completely different calendar and it renamed all of the months in a year. So this is a very similar ambition. And you could say that if you look at the two most important revolutions that ever happened, again, these are Neolithic agrarian on one end and industrial on the other, you're truly talking about ways that the entire human culture had changed twice. So If we're talking about the way we live, systems of beliefs that we have, what we consider to be sacred, what different faiths that we have, it all goes back to the agrarian revolution. Truly, it all goes back to agriculture, and it all goes back to sedentary lifestyle. This whole idea of division of labor, of social stratification, of personal and private property, like all of these things go back to agrarian revolution. And so we now understand, we now have enough of a historical distance to understand just how incredibly important this step was and how big of a revolution it was. Because if we're talking about the agrarian revolution, we truly talk about every single aspect of humanity having changed. So people who were around this period, we're talking about the beginning of the 20th century, were aware of this, if not conceptually, but then intuitively. And they were aware that if we truly want to advance as human species, we also have to change everything. Now, the difference this time would be that they were making a conscientious effort, unlike people back in the agrarian times, of the times of the Neolithic agrarian revolution, that were perhaps being more spontaneous about all of this. But it doesn't really matter. You could say that there was this overwhelming idea that everything had to change, and this is exactly what they were engaged in. So it's basically this whole idea of transcendence that is sought through very strictly material terms. So this is a bit of a conundrum to understand that through purely material means we seek to achieve spirituality, pure spirit, and we seek to unleash ourselves, to liberate ourselves from matter. So abstract art is this radical refusal of matter. It's a radical move towards pure spirit, but it's done in the most material way possible because it is done with pure visuals. The whole idea is that we want pure visuals, and we don't want to pollute and clutter our visual representations with things like meaning and story and politics and ideology and narration and what'll have you. So it's something that also takes us back to the medieval period. It takes us, in this case, right back to Gothic style, because Gothic style was all about the sensual experience that takes us to a spiritual realm, that it was a material way of communicating the divine. So it was this whole idea of a Gothic cathedral that is Virgin Mary incarnate, that is a bridge between the carnal and the spiritual. That ultimate goal is spiritual in nature, but what takes us there is purely material and downright sensual. So you could say that the same dynamism, the same aim exists in abstract art. Now we need to understand that this is all situated in the very important connection that exists between expressionism and abstract art. We see this through the figure of Kandinsky, who was one of the leading, one of the founding fathers of both expressionism and of abstract art. So we see this medieval inspiration present in expressionism, their interest in Gothic, their interest in emotions, and their interest in personality. So they too sought ways to liberate themselves, and they too sought to represent spiritual things rather than material, but again in material terms. So there is a lot of this inspiration in religious character of abstract art. And if we want to properly address this, I think we need to address a very important distinction that is present in abstract art, and something that will help us understand a lot of other arts as well, something that will come back and present itself many, many times, especially when we start talking about different periods of history of art, not only in terms of analogies, but in terms of themselves. We are talking about a very Christian versus pagan dynamics. We are talking about the difference between the holy on one end and the sacred on the other. In most cases, in vernacular, we use these interchangeably, but this is downright wrong, and nothing could be further from the truth. Sacred and holy are very, very different. So if we're talking about the pagan faith, we're talking about, in most cases, rituals, and in many cases, sacrificial rituals. So this is the idea that sacred as quality, the sacred as a spiritual substance, is something that can be created. So in visual terms, this is something that can be represented by a square. And we go back, of course, to the square of Malevich, the black square. So sacred is something that we can create through ritual. If we repeat a certain action a certain amount of times, it becomes ritualistic in nature, it becomes a ritual, and if we repeat it in a certain manner, it becomes sacred. So in most cases, this takes us back to this whole idea of the sacred space. It takes us back to this notion that sacred really is the concentration of reality. We mentioned this when we spoke about Renaissance, and that in many cases, concentration of reality happens mostly through violence. If we slaughter an animal, if we take a life, this is, in a certain way, concentration of reality. So it's something that involves everyone involved, everyone present, in a very concrete manner that is, in a way, horrendous, but it's also impressive and is very engaging. So we are talking about concentration of reality. We're talking about the sacred as such. The important thing is that this is something that is achievable, that is something that is possible to create, and something that has a very, very clear material presence. So on the other end of that spectrum, we have what is holy. And holiness really has to do with Christianity. It has to do with the very spiritual nature of Christianity, that we know that Christianity is the religion of a book. It's not a religion of a statue. So we will mention a couple of key differences between these two terms, between these two notions of logos on one end and eidos on the other. So holiness has to do with spirit, and it has to do with divinity. Holiness cannot be created. It is not something we can achieve. It's eternal. It's perfect. It's something that is achieved. Now, it's etymologically speaking close to the notion of holiness, of whole, of something that is perfect and complete. And something can only be perfect and complete in spiritual terms, in the realm of spirit, in the realm of abstractions. So when we're talking about holiness, we are not talking about matter, we are talking about spirit. And we are talking about this tendency that we have, that we exist in material realm, but we want to make ourselves more spiritual. So this is, again, a very medieval ambition. This is a very medieval tendency, if you will. So it's this whole idea that this tension between holiness and sacredness, between the holy and the sacred, exists, of course, in the realm of arts, because the realm of arts, by definition, if we're talking about visual arts, is something that belongs in the realm of the matter, of material. So we use material means to create statues and paintings and other things. So there is this tension in dominantly Christian mainstream art and culture and history between holiness and between sacredness, between paganism and between Christianity, all the more present from Gothic period onwards, when we fully embrace pagan means of communication, when we fully embrace images and statues, and especially stained glass windows, to become vessels of communication, to become basically the vessels of church dogma. Now, this is a bit of a contradiction, really, that we want to communicate highly spiritual concepts, concepts that deal with human soul, with eternity, with all these things. We want to communicate those with material means. And we already addressed this apparent absurd and paradox, and we'll be doing it again. So you have the very same dilemma in abstract art. You have this tendency of achieving completely, perfectly wholesome excursion into the realm of perfect eternal truths that are, again, abstract in nature, but you want to do this through material means. So you have this tension between sacred, that is material, and holy, that is spiritual. And I think that one of the main reasons why we make this connection between abstract art and medieval art, Gothic and Gothic revival context, if you will, is exactly this dilemma that exists, that is carried over from previous eras, and that will then later inspire sequent eras. So I would argue that abstract art is one of the most ambitious, if not the most ambitious, artistic formations and stylistic formations and truly notions in whole of history of art, not just in the 20th century, but whole of history of art. We've never had such an ambitious attempt. We've never had such a drastic, radical departure from reality as such, from the material realm, from the realm of what is empirically observable. So we've never had an excursion into pure abstract world of abstract forms and the form of in the world of abstractions. We had art that was more or less formal, representational. Yes, representational is the word I was looking for. But it was never this dramatic. This was never this drastic departure from reality. And this is basically a claim that art is not to be representative. Now, this is really important. Let's go back to Kandinsky and whatever he was doing. And let's take a couple of examples coming from his paintings. That Kandinsky, in his mature stages, after his initial stages where he was still dealing with representative art, was creating things that are literally divorced from this world. And he was creating things that were very intentionally non-representative. Now, this is really important to understand. If you look at Picasso's art, you can say that he deforms anything he can as much as he can, but he always stays representational. He always represents a certain thing, in most cases, female body. But Kandinsky doesn't do that. He represent things that do not exist. He actually doesn't represent things at all. He doesn't represent anything. He is playing with forms. He's playing with colors, with lines, with masses. And he drives this notion even further forward by not naming his paintings in a way that you would expect. So a lot of Kandinsky's paintings are named composition number 25 or composition number 34 or composition, give it any random number, or very generic explanations like painting with black blot, or painting with the red square, or painting with the red line. So most generic explanations, most generic titles of what we see in front of us. And what he's communicating by making these paintings and by naming them is that it doesn't really matter what is represented. He doesn't represent anything. That's the whole point. He is just playing with colors. He's playing with forms, and he's seeking the best and most optimal relation between colors and forms. So he is basically doing what a musician would do. If you think about this experiment, when you listen to music, any type of music that doesn't feature lyrics, so let's say you're listening to Beethoven, just a random example, you have different states of mind listening to this music. So it can make you excited, it can make you sad, it can make you joyful, it doesn't really matter. But you're not trying to understand what's it about. This is what is truly important. So you're not thinking about a story that music is telling. You're not trying to comprehend it with words. You're not trying to verbalize your understanding of this music. You're just enjoying it on a sensual level. And this is exactly what Kandinsky is trying to achieve with his paintings. He is not trying to tell you, look, this is the crucifixion, this is a chair, this is a bowl of fruit. It doesn't even matter if a topic is very elevated, if it's a saint or a martyr, something that happened in Christian lore, or a completely banal affair, as you see a lot of in Impressionism, people playing cards or people picnicking, or whichever other thing. So it is not representative. It doesn't stand for anything. That's the most important thing. And this is basically a considerable challenge. If you think about this, it's a considerable challenge to untrain yourself and to make yourself appreciate these works of art properly. This is not easy to do because, purely evolutionary speaking, not to say biologically speaking, we are trained, we are hardwired to recognize things. And you could argue that our survival depends to this day upon recognizing things. If you wander into the traffic and you see cars coming, going left and right, it is of great importance for you to recognize that it's a car so that you would know not to step in front of it. So to this day, our survival depends on our capacity to recognize things and to properly name them and to properly understand them. So this is exactly what Kandinsky wants to undo. He wants us to unlearn recognition patterns. So this is why I say that this whole thing is basically going at the very roots of humanity. It's incredibly ambitious. It's trying to rewrite the very code of humanity, of human behavior, of what humans do, of what makes us human. And this is basically going back to this medieval idea of rejection, of renunciation of this material world, of everything that is basically seen as a work of the Satan, something that is seen as downright evil. Again, matter is evil, possession is evil. This is what these people are arguing. So what is this untraining all about? Well, it's about a process that happens so fast that it's so spontaneous and so deeply ingrained in us as human beings that in most cases we're simply not aware of it. And the process is basically us recognizing things. So you just throw a random look, around you, and immediately you recognize things. So you say, okay, this is a wall, this is a lamp, this is the camera, that is a person, that's a face. So this happens so quickly that you're not even aware of it. You just instantaneously recognize things, and then you store them, you process them. Now, this is all the more important when we're talking about romanticism, when we're talking about fascination with grotesque, when we're talking about monstrosity, because a monster is something that announces itself and that commands your attention. You absolutely have to look at it, etymologically speaking, by design. So this whole idea of recognizing is incredibly important. This whole idea of unrecognizable is even more important. Freud has an entire theory about this. So what Kandinsky is saying is that in the world of art, we need to start unrecognizing things. We need to train ourselves to make our eyes basically not do this thing, to make our minds not do this thing that we instantaneously do. So when we're looking at a painting, a Kandinsky painting, or arguably any other painting, this is also something we can apply on Renaissance paintings, we can try to not recognize things. We can try to say, okay, I'm not looking at a crucifixion right now. I'm not looking at the birth of Jesus. I'm not looking at Virgin Mary. I'm just looking at colors and forms and how they come together. So if you look at a Kandinsky painting, this is exactly what you're supposed to do. You're not supposed to recognize anything. And I invite you to do this experiment because it is very interesting and very hard. So you look at a painting and immediately you think, oh, this could be a bird. Oh, this could be two people kissing. Or this could be a bridge. And none of these answers are correct because it's not anything. That's the whole point. A lot of Kandinsky's paintings, especially from later periods, from 40s and onwards, look very strangely organic. They look as if you were looking through a microscope. So whatever you would see under a microscope, germs and whatnot. So his paintings have this very organic, very material, and very sensual quality, but they do not stand for any of those things. They stand for abstract forms. So he is demanding us undergo this untraining process, so not a training process, but an untraining process where we stop recognizing things. And even more importantly, we start thinking about them as something we need to recognize. Because let's say I see an image of an apple, be it a painting or a photography or an apple in real life, it doesn't matter. Immediately, I think about everything that apple can represent. So I think about vitamin C, or I think about fructose, or I think about Adam and Eve. So there are many different associations, and we should liberate ourselves from all of them. All of these associations, all of these meanings, they're pure clutter. They don't help us. They take us further towards the material world and everything that has to do with it. So we are supposed to just contemplate this apple without any contemplation. It's kind of Buddhist if you think about it. You're not supposed to let your mind roam. You're supposed to calm your mind and just observe this apple as basically a presence that has its form, it has its colors, and you're not supposed to think about its meaning, about its purpose, about all of the other things an apple can be. And this is not easy because, again, we spend our lives living in this material realm thinking about relations between things. I mean, what are we doing now? We're talking about analogy between Gothic revival, Gothic art, and abstract art. So we recognize connections between things, but this is exactly the opposite of what we are supposed to do in this particular case. So Kandinsky argues, and all of abstract art really is all about, just enjoying whatever is visual on a visual plane of understanding. Disassociating your mind from it, disassociating all these associations and analogies from it, and just taking it in as it is. And this is something that you understand exists with other abstract artists. Now, I want to go back and we'll wrap it up with this because I think we went over an hour, that this is a very important work that we have to undergo if we want to truly become better humans and if we want to find ourselves in the better world that the entirety of the early 20th century is going on about. It doesn't matter if it's a communist or a capitalist perspective. It doesn't matter if it's Italian futurism or it's Soviet suprematism. they are united in dreaming about a better world. They don't necessarily agree on what kind of world it's going to be, what kind of economy it's going to have, and all the other things, but they're all clear on one thing. They want a better world. They want a new world. They want the world to be conformed to the newfound realities, so to the industrial reality. And so, if we want to find ourselves in this new world, we have to transcend the existing one. And the way to do that is to basically unlearn how we observe the world, to divorce our spirit from matter. And this is one of the exercises that we need to do. We need to start unrecognizing things. We need to start creating immediate associations. So you see how comparable this is, for example, to pointillism and their idea that they want to truly understand perception. So they really want to go to the nitty-gritty details, literally on an atomic or cellular level of perception, of how the eye functions. So they really want to go as far as it's humanly possible in this regard. And you can see how this ambition is continued. You can see how there's this whole idea that we no longer want to understand human perception, we want to transcend it. We want to basically create a completely new perception. We want to create the new visual language. We want to create the new way of communicating. And if you think about literary theories that were around, like Russian formalism, for example, you see that they're going in the same direction. They want new understanding of things. They want to understand and establish new connections between things. So it's all about this incredible ambition about the new world that is to be created. And again, I argue that this is a very, very medieval tendency. This whole idea of transcending the material realm, this is very medieval in its very core. Now, I want to make a brief comparison between Kandinsky on one end and František Kupka on the other, because there's a very important topic to be addressed here that has to do with chaos or apparent chaos and order. So you could argue that František Kupka has very similar fundamentals of his expression when it comes to being non-representational, when it comes to being informal, and when it comes to this idea that the work of art is not to be recognized, it's not to be associated with any existing thing. But the thing with Kupka is that his paintings tend to be very clearly well orchestrated and very well designed. So they feature a notion of rhythm, a notion of harmony that is very easy to understand. So they're quite graphic in this regard. That's not the case with Kandinsky. Kandinsky presents us with apparent chaos. So paintings done by Kandinsky are not as clearly well structured as paintings done by Kupka. So they represent a different layer of structure, a different layer of organization, and they appear as chaotic. Now, this is something that will be very important when we start talking about abstract expressionism later. And we'll talk about Pollock, we'll talk about color field theory, we'll talk about all these things where chaos has a very, very important place. And we'll understand how roots that Kandinsky had in expressionism become really important and really obvious. So Kupka is a very harmonious artist. He presents us with a lot of visual harmony. That's not the case with Kandinsky. And I would argue that Kandinsky is a bit closer to the initial intent, that is again, in my understanding, medieval, than Kupka is. So he tries to remove himself from a simple vision of order and he moves towards a more complex one. But the point that with both of these artists is that they want to represent laws of painting in themselves and not applied to other things. So I think we went well over an hour, and I would like to bring it together here. So we're gonna stop ourselves here, and I thank you for your attention. This has been a very interesting conversation that I've had with myself. Very interesting presentation, a topic that is dear and close to my heart. I hope to have a lot of comments. I hope to have a vivid discussion in the comment section. And I'm looking forward to seeing everyone again. Bye.